Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at violence,
Okay.
but not just, the typical kind of violence. We're
Right.
going to be going a little bit deeper and exploring the changing nature of violence,
Mm-hmm.
how it's manifested in modern society.
Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about not just physical violence, but also,
Psychological.
psychological and
Yeah.
systemic violence.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the source material that we're going to be using for this is,
Byung-Chul Han.
yes, Byung-Chul Han's Topology of Violence.
Topology of Violence. That's right.
So our mission today is to really understand how violence has evolved,
Yes.
become maybe a little more subtle, and how that's impacting us
Right now, today.
today.
Yeah. So Han argues that violence is like a constant throughout history,
Right.
but its forms are always kind of changing.
Okay.
And he uses some really interesting historical examples to kind of illustrate this point.
Okay.
He contrasts the very sort of in-your-face violence of ancient Greece and Rome. You think about the myth of Adonis
Okay.
being killed by a boar,
Right.
which represents kind of this idea of the culture's inner violence.
Right.
And then you have the gladiatorial games,
Yeah.
where violence was entertainment. It was a display of power.
It was a spectacle.
A spectacle, exactly.
Yeah.
And even seen as a religious duty in Roman society.
Oh, wow.
So it was very much ingrained in their
Just culture.
culture, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting how these ancient cultures were almost obsessed with displaying violence so openly.
Yeah,
But in modern times, we've kind of shifted towards hiding it away.
right.
Executions happen behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And even concentration camps were deliberately located outside of cities, you know?
It's like they were trying to make them disappear.
Yeah, almost
Out of fight, out of mind.
we're uncomfortable with this outward expression of violence.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's gone away.
Right.
It's become more insidious, more
Right.
ingrained in our systems,
Right.
and even in ourselves.
So the battlefield has shifted then from external enemies to our own internal conflicts.
In a way, yes.
And this reminds me of Freud's idea that our conscience is formed by turning our aggression inwards.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're constantly at war with ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, on top of that,
Yeah.
we have discipline and societal structures which perpetuate a more subtle form of violence without ever needing to resort to brute force.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, if we, in our modern civilized world,
Right.
are truly less violent than our ancestors, or if we've just become better at disguising it.
It's a really good question.
Yeah.
And it's something that Han really kind of grapples with throughout the book.
So if violence has changed so much, what are the root causes?
Oh, yeah.
What's driving it?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
Well, Han explores a couple of interesting theories to try to answer this question.
Okay.
He starts with Freud's idea of the death drive
Mm-hmm.
as this kind of root of our destructive urges.
Okay.
But then he contrasts that with René Girard's theory
Oh.
of mimetic rivalry,
Okay.
which says that we desire things
Mm-hmm.
simply because other people desire them.
Okay.
And this leads to conflict.
So it's not necessarily about needing something. It's about wanting what someone else has.
Yeah, it's more about that kind of
Keeping up with the Joneses.
keeping up with the Joneses, exactly.
Yeah.
But that kind of runs into problems explaining like violence driven by basic survival needs.
Yeah, or even just the desire for things like money. I mean, I'm not exactly like craving a stack of cash because my neighbor has one.
Exactly. And that's one of Han's main criticisms of Girard's theory,
Okay.
that it can't fully explain all types of violence.
Okay.
He argues that there's something more primal at play,
Okay.
something that links back to this ancient view of violence
Okay.
as a power struggle against death itself.
Against death.
Against death, yeah.
Wow, that's a thought-provoking idea.
Yeah.
So tell me more about that.
So Han uses the example of ancient warriors
Okay.
who believed they could absorb the mana or life force
Okay.
of their enemies by killing them.
Interesting.
And some even went so far as to consume the flesh of their enemies,
Oh, wow.
believing it would give them greater power.
That's pretty intense.
It's a completely different way of thinking about the world and about death.
Yeah.
For these ancient societies, violence wasn't just about brutality.
Right.
It was a way to confront
Mm.
and potentially even overcome
Right.
the power of death.
It sounds almost ritualistic, like they were trying to cheat death somehow.
Yeah, there's definitely a spiritual element to it.
And this contrasts sharply with our modern, more rationalized approach to punishment.
Right.
I mean, we focus on deterring crime and rehabilitating criminals.
Exactly.
But these ancient societies saw violence as a way to counteract the power of death itself.
Yeah, they saw it as a necessary part of life.
So have we truly become less violent, or have we just shifted our focus? Instead of battling other people, are we now fighting against time itself?
That's a really interesting question.
Our obsession with anti-aging and life extension?
Right.
Could that be seen as a subtle form of violence against death?
It's possible.
What do you think?
I think it's a question worth exploring.
Yeah.
And it actually leads us perfectly into the next layer that Han explores.
Okay.
Which is the psychological and social dimensions of violence.
Right.
So if the battlefield has shifted inward, how does that affect our minds, our relationships, our very sense of self?
Yeah. That's what we're going to get into next.
Exactly.
Okay.
So buckle up.
All right. So it's almost like the enemy is now ourselves.
Yeah, in a way.
That's a pretty disturbing thought.
It is. It's unsettling.
Yeah.
And Han kind of dives right into this by looking at the achievement-oriented society that we live in. You know, we're constantly bombarded with these messages about being successful, productive, optimizing every aspect of our lives.
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
It really is. There's this constant pressure to be on all the time.
Yes.
And if you don't measure up, you feel like a failure.
Exactly. And that leads to self-exploitation burnout.
Right.
Even in some cases, suicide.
Yeah.
It's as if the project of self-improvement becomes a weapon turned inwards.
So the violence comes from within, from our own drive to achieve.
In a sense, yes.
It's heavy stuff.
It is. And this ties into what philosopher Elaine Ehrenberg observed.
Okay.
That depression might actually stem from a lack of constructive conflict in our lives.
Okay.
But Han takes this even further.
How so?
He argues that depression isn't just about lacking something, but about an excess of positivity.
Hold on, too much positivity.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I follow that.
So think about it.
Okay.
We're constantly told to be happy, productive, successful.
Right.
It's relentless.
Yeah.
And when we inevitably fall short of these unrealistic expectations, we internalize that failure.
Right.
And turn the blame inwards.
Oh, so it's like we're setting ourselves up to fail in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Because these expectations are so unrealistic.
Exactly. And that's the violence of positivity.
Wow. I never thought of it that way. It's like we're trapped in this cycle of pressure and self-criticism.
Exactly.
And it's everywhere, social media advertising, even our own internal dialogues.
Right.
So it's not just about individual psychology. It's deeply political, too. And Han examines this through the lens of Carl Schmitt's work, this political theorist who argued that the core of politics is the distinction between friend and enemy.
Right.
And for Schmitt, this wasn't about morality or aesthetics.
It was an existential struggle, a matter of survival.
But doesn't that get tricky in today's globalized world?
Yeah.
I mean, the lines between us and them are so blurred.
Absolutely. You raise a very important point.
Yeah, I mean, look at cyber attacks, for instance.
Right.
They can come from anywhere.
Exactly.
It's really hard to
pinpoint
the enemy.
And Schmitt was writing in a very different era.
Yeah.
But his ideas still resonate.
Okay.
Han highlights how difficult it is to apply this friend-enemy distinction to our current reality.
Yeah.
Where traditional enemies are much harder to define.
And the way we work and live is so different, too.
Exactly.
I mean, Schmitt seemed to value strong character and decisiveness in leaders.
Right.
But today's world demands constant flexibility and adaptation.
Yeah, you got to be able to pivot.
Yeah, you got to be able to flow.
Exactly.
It's hard to know what to stand for when everything's constantly in flux.
And that's where Han's argument gets really interesting.
Okay.
He suggests that this blurring of traditional boundaries, this lack of a clear other to push against, can actually lead to a more self-destructive form of violence.
Okay, so rather than channeling our energy outwards, we turn it inwards.
Exactly.
It's almost like we're losing the ability to resist, to even define what we're resisting against.
Right. And that brings us to Han's fascinating concept of the macro and microphysics of violence.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these two types of violence.
All right, so imagine violence having two distinct flavors.
Okay.
Macro violence is the kind we're all familiar with. Wars, assaults, the obvious physical stuff.
Right.
Think of it as an external force that disrupts our inner order.
Okay.
A clear clash between self and other.
That makes sense.
But what about microviolence?
Microviolence is subtler.
Okay.
It's like this constant hum of pressure, a feeling of being overwhelmed and overstimulated.
Right.
Think of it as the never-ending to-do list.
Yeah.
The avalanche of emails, the pressure to be on all the time.
Right.
It might not leave bruises.
Right.
But it can definitely take its toll.
That's so true. I think we've all felt that pressure in our own lives.
Yeah.
It's like a slow burn that wears you down over time.
Exactly.
And it's so hard to pinpoint because it's woven into the fabric of our everyday lives.
Right.
It's not a single enemy.
No.
It's the system itself.
You're exactly right. And that's one of Han's key insights.
He helps us to see how violence has become systemic, ingrained in the very structure of our lives.
So how do we even begin to resist this kind of violence?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, it feels like we're all complicit in some way.
And that's a crucial question, and it leads us to Han's discussion of the violence of globalization.
So we talked about microviolence and how it's kind of baked into our systems.
Right.
But how does globalization fit into all of this?
Well, Han argues that globalization actually intensifies these trends.
Okay.
He draws on Foucault's observation that modern power operates by managing and optimizing life,
Right.
even while waging, increasingly destructive wars.
Yeah, it's like we're obsessed with efficiency and control,
Right.
even if it means, sacrificing our well-being or even causing harm.
Yeah.
And we're constantly pushing for more, faster, better. It never seems to end.
And that's where Jean Baudrillard's concept of virulent violence comes in.
Okay.
He compares it to a virus
Right.
that operates through contagion and breaks down our immunity.
Right.
It spreads rapidly and affects everyone.
But didn't we say earlier that Han kind of critiques this viral model?
You're right, he does.
Yeah.
It doesn't fully capture the nuances of what Han's describing.
Okay.
He's talking about a more insidious form of violence that emerges from within.
Right.
It's self-exploitation disguised as freedom.
Right.
We're encouraged to push ourselves to the limit.
To hustle and grind.
Exactly.
But it can come at a huge cost to our mental and physical health.
Right. It's not sustainable.
So where does this leave us?
Yeah.
If the enemy is within, how do we even begin to resist?
That's where Han's discussion of the end of the enemy becomes really interesting.
Okay.
He references Baudrillard's idea that the enemy has evolved over time from a wolf.
Okay.
Which represents this kind of external threat to a rat, a hidden danger, and finally to a virus, an internal contagion. But is the enemy truly disappearing or just changing form?
I guess that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It feels like we're constantly fighting against something, but the target is constantly shifting.
Right. It's like trying to hit a moving target in the dark.
Exactly.
And Han argues that this blurring of the enemy makes it much harder to resist.
Okay.
He cautions against romanticizing individual singularity as resistance, because most of us are still deeply complicit in the systems that perpetuate this violence.
Yeah, we all benefit from globalization in some way.
Exactly.
Even if it comes at a cost.
Right.
It makes you wonder if true resistance is even possible in this kind of world.
It's a challenging question.
Yeah.
And Han doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
But he does suggest that recognizing this new form of violence is the first step.
Okay.
We need to understand how it operates, how it affects us, and how we might be contributing to it.
So it's about awareness, but also about taking responsibility for our own actions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If the line between victim and perpetrator is blurred, then we all have a role to play in challenging this new form of violence.
So where do we go from here?
Well, it starts with questioning the systems and structures that perpetuate it.
Okay.
Do we really need to work 60 hours a week?
Right.
Do we need to be constantly connected to our phone?
Yeah. Are we addicted to our devices?
These are the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, it is.
But I feel like this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the subtle ways that violence operates in our world.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
So to sum up, we've explored how the nature of violence has shifted.
Right.
From external to internal, from lack to excess, from explosive to implosive.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, and we've seen how this new form of violence is deeply embedded in our systems and even within ourselves.
And we've delved into some complex theories. But ultimately, it's about understanding how these forces shape our lives and our world.
Right. It's about looking at ourselves.
Yeah.
Our system.
And asking those tough questions.
Yeah, and asking ourselves difficult questions about our own complicity and our potential for resistance.
Well said.
As we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
Does the blurring of victim and perpetrator in this new form of violence make us all complicit? What does this mean for our understanding of freedom and responsibility?
That's something to ponder.
Yeah, these are questions that deserve careful consideration, and we encourage you to continue exploring them.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody.
We hope it sparks some new insights and inspire you to see the world in a different light.
And we'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new and fascinating topic. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.